Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles program that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly show in which we talk about anything Beatles, any part of their past, things going on in the news, anything that we feel like talking about is covered here on this show. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the regular co-hosts. You might know me from my other Beatles program, a syndicated Beatles show called Every Little Thing, and I'm being joined by my three other regular co-hosts. First of all, the writer for Beatles Examiner, we have Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
Also, from Beatle Fan Magazine, he's been writing for them since the very beginning, from 1978, I think the year was, and that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And also one of the writers for Beatle Fan, but he's also a freelance writer and a musicologist, that being Allan Kozinn. Hey, Allan.
Hello, Ken, and hello, everyone.
On the program this time, we're going to be talking about a number of things and some things happening in the news. We're going to be commenting about a few recordings of the Beatles, live recordings that just got some airplay on the radio. We're going to be discussing in just a few moments. But before we do that, we want to make mention of a couple of very dear people to us in the Beatle community and talk about, in the case of Rick Glover, who was a terrific guest with us here recently on the show. He's the guy who started the Fans on the Run Club and got to go on stage with Paul McCartney and give him a button for the club. He's seen Paul in concert more than anybody else we know, and he has a very serious health condition. And Al, would you like to comment about that?
Yeah, a few of us had been advised by Rick a few weeks back that he was undergoing chemo and radiation treatment for cancer, which has appeared and gone away and reappeared again. And so he finally made it public, apparently, on Facebook today. Steve advised us of that just a little while ago. And obviously, we want to send our best wishes to Rick, who is a friend of us all, and obviously part of the Beatle fan family for almost as long as I have, and
Right.
So we want to extend our best wishes and our prayers to Rick.
Right. We're all thinking of you, Rick.
Absolutely.
And someone else that you're more familiar with, Steve. I'm actually, I'm not really familiar with this other Beatle fan that you were mentioning.
It's Pat Niemi Kubaki, and I hope that's the way she pronounces her name. I'm reading it off my screen. I have had some contact with her in the past, and she's a big Beatle fan. I've seen some of her posts, and she's a huge Beatle fan. And she's apparently her husband posted this morning that she's having some real serious health problems, and she deserves our thoughts and prayers too. So I was sending them out for both Rick and Pat.
Okay.
So get better,
Anybody?
guys.
Yes, yeah. Get better, both of you.
Okay, we're going to start with a news item that Steve just wrote about today, and we're taping this on August the 17th, about an appearance on Chris Carter's show on KLOS the previous day on Sunday, and Vince Calandra was a guest on the show. And this was someone that played a part in Beatle history because he was there during the rehearsals for the Ed Sullivan show. And a lot of people know that he kind of subbed at the time for George. George he had a sore throat at the time, was it?
Strep throat.
And also Neil Aspinall subbed for George momentarily.
Right.
But for a while there, Vince was there, and they put a Beatle wig on him. And I think many of us have seen the photo of that. But on Chris Carter's show, they talked about this footage that exists from the rehearsals. So you can tell us more about that, Steve.
Well, I'd interviewed Vince a few years ago, and yeah, the big thing with Vince is that there's a picture of him him standing in for George with a Beatle wig on, and he even talked about that yesterday. He talked about how that happened. He said there's also a picture I'm sure everybody's seen, or a lot of people have seen, of Ed Sullivan with the wig on, and Sullivan said, I guess Sullivan got a lot of laughs, and he said, "Let's put this on Vince," and because I guess Vince at that point was with them, and they did, and they took a picture. Well, Vince revealed yesterday, and apparently had not revealed it before, that somebody took some home movies of that particular moment of Vince standing in with the Beatles, and Vince now has the footage. Apparently, it costs quite a bit, $100,000, to get hold of this footage. And Vince has pictures that he brought with him yesterday to the show that show both black and white and color. And you know that if you saw the original show, the show was in black and white, and so the fact that there is actually color pictures of that day is pretty interesting. And anyway, so he brought those pictures. He brought that with him yesterday, and I don't know if they showed. Obviously, I couldn't see on the radio whether they actually showed the footage, but they did show the pic. They did pass the pictures around, and so people did get to see that. And there actually is a post on Facebook that I linked to in my story of the pictures, so that you can see the pictures, and they are indeed in black and white and in color. But it's really, I mean, it's just, pictures of them rehearsing. Unfortunately, apparently there's no sound, since movie cameras in those days were all silent anyway. But we do have some unseen images of the Beatles, which seem to get a lot of interest, no matter how unseen they are, or what circumstances they're under. Anytime you hear unseen images of the Beatles, especially in auctions, people go wild. And apparently, and I'm sure this is really, I mean, this is kind of interesting because of the historical aspect of where they were at the time. But anyway,
We're talking about February 7th, 64, right? That would have been that
right.
rehearsal.
Right.
The 8th.
The 8th? Okay.
Yeah.
The 8th? Oh, okay.
Oh, right.
Saturday.
I thought there was something interesting in Vince Calandra's remarks, where he talked about how, they thought it was just going to be a rock band, but they knew it was going to be a bit more because they'd been tracking the Beatles for some time. And he talked about how we had our people over there seeing what was going on with the Beatles as early as, July and August 63. The very, very familiar story, which I think Bruce Spicer has to some degree debunked in his books, but you still hear the story all the time about how Ed Sullivan first heard of the Beatles when he arrived at London Airport at Heathrow, I guess, in November 1963, when they were coming back from Sweden.
Yeah.
So, and everyone has been saying, oh, I don't know, Ed, that doesn't sound that likely. And Bruce got to the bottom of it. But now here you have Vince Calandra just saying, out of nowhere, oh, yeah, we were tracking them in July and August 63, which means that Ed's whole story was really just kind of fabricated in a way. You know what I mean? I think it just sort of adds extra weight to, to the research that Bruce has done, showing. So anyway,
yeah, because it seems like everybody has has a story of one kind of or another. Over the weekend, Louise Harrison at the fest at the fest in Chicago on stage told Tom Frangione that she had had a DJ in Benton, Illinois, play From Me to You, and which meant that that DJ was playing it for the first time in America, which is absolutely untrue, because an hour and a half earlier, Dick Biondi had been on stage, and Bruce Spicer had played the audio clip, which I believe you can find on YouTube, of him playing Please Please Me in February of 63. So, it's like everybody has a different story and a different version of the history, and it's sometimes the truth gets kind of mixed up
Yeah. Well, and Louise wouldn't necessarily have been aware of what Dick Biondi was doing. You know, they were not in the same place. And
Right, but you
so,
would think that 50 years later she would realize that that wasn't the first time that
right. Yeah.
that record had been played in America.
And it makes
Yeah.
perfect sense that since those singles came out in '63 in America, and Please Please Me preceded From Me to
Yes.
You, and you
Right.
know that all the singles got some airplay somewhere
Mm-hmm.
in little
Right.
pockets here and there,
Right.
that somebody had to take a chance on Please Please Me.
Exactly.
So I'm
Exactly.
not sure if Dick Biondi was the first one. He probably was.
He was certainly one of the very first.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
He's the first in which there is audio documentation. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
Yeah. And as I said when Mark Lapidus was a guest on our show, the very fact that VJ Records was in Chicago,
Yes, had a lot to do with
and WLS was I guess the biggest top 40 station at the time in
Yes.
Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes natural sense that they would have a relationship together. So
Sure.
yeah, I would believe that would be either the first or one of the first
Mm-hmm.
to play
Absolutely.
Please Please Me.
Right.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right. Another big story is concerning two of the cuts from the Beatles' 1965 Shea concert, which were played the stereo versions of the songs on Chris Carter's show. So, what exactly is the story behind these stereo versions, and how that appeared now, how that has surfaced?
Well, we had Dave Schwensen
More
Right.
David.
on a couple of weeks ago, and in his book, he actually talks a lot about how the concert was recorded, and he has quotes in there from Ron Fermanak, who, when he was working at Apple in the early '90s, they put together a Shea documentary, and he completely remixed the soundtrack using basically the tapes that had come down, through the people who had recorded it. Bob Fine had produced the recordings, and now those recordings have been bootlegged. And they're they're very listenable, but parts of them are very rough. And Ron was able to make some seriously good stereo mixes. I say seriously good, based on what he said, and I kind of believe him. So these have never come out because the Shea documentary has never come out. One of the many things sitting on Apple's shelves that they bothered to put together and then not release. And so Steve, I think, heard the show, Chris Carter's Beatle Breakfast, where Dave Morell by himself, or was Fermanak with him?
No, it was just Morel. It was Morel and Calandra. Fermanak was not there.
So why don't you take it from there, Steve?
Well, they played two songs, and I believe it was. I didn't hear the whole show, unfortunately. I have it, and I haven't listened to it completely. But they did play "I'm Down." They played "Dizzy Miss Lizzy" because that I heard, and I believe they also played "I'm Down." Let me point out, though, that we've all, a lot of us, I assume, have heard that bootleg of the stereo tracks from Shea that came out last year, and I listened to that over the weekend, and I did hear the stereo tracks, some of the stereo tracks before the show, and the quality on the stuff that was played on the show was not the same, and in fact was much better than the bootleg. The bootleg stuff sounded, and I would like to hear your opinions, guys. The bootleg stuff sounded really tinny in spots. Some of those tracks, not all the Shea tracks on that bootleg were in stereo.
Right, that's true.
Right. So, but I mean, the stereo tracks. I remember when I first heard it, I was kind of a little disappointed, partially because the whole thing wasn't in stereo, but also because the stereo did not sound really good. It didn't sound great. I mean, it didn't. It wasn't a straight. If that was supposed to be a straight transfer of those tracks, they did a hell of a lousy job. The stuff I heard before the show was much better, much better. I think that's important that the stuff that Carter played was much better than has been out there before. Allan, you agree? Did you hear you didn't hear the show?
I didn't hear them yet. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. What the thing that came out a couple of years ago was, I think Fermanagh has basically said himself that it basically was his edit of the Shea film that he did in 1991, but that the soundtrack wasn't all his finished soundtrack.
What came out? Remember, there were two sets of things that came out. There was the line recordings,
right,
and then there was the stuff that came out last year. So there's
right,
two
on the
different,
DVD.
right. So there's two different. We're talking about two different bootlegs here.
Right, and they sound very different from each other too, because the line recordings are the ones that are a little bit rough, and the DVD sounds a lot better because, I mean, they made some effort to do some mixing and may have used a preliminary soundtrack that Fermanagh put together. I'm not sure what the story is, but
Right.
it was really kind of interesting. It's supposed to represent his 1991 edit, and so, for instance, you don't have Brian Epstein speaking during "Can't Buy Me Love." You just have the track, and it's, as Dave had pointed out in his book, and when he was here, I guess, they got rid of all of the extra film from Shea. So the only thing that he had to work with were the film from the finished product. And it looks largely like the film that we know, but he did a bit of editing and did a bit of replacing of things here and there, and replaced the soundtrack. I'd love to hear what he actually did, which apparently the DVD bootleg doesn't have. So, and you have to wonder, don't you? Here it was, the 50th anniversary of the Beatles at Shea Stadium, a gig that is, beyond the Beatles world. It's a big deal because it started the whole stadium rock thing. And you would think that Apple, who has had this on their shelves, finished product, all done since 1991, 92, certainly before the anthology came out, would have taken this opportunity to release it, wouldn't you guys?
And on top of that, as Morel said to me, when I talked to him and Ron last week, and also he said it on Carter's show, it was shot in 35 millimeter. The quality is fantastic, and there's no, and it's not. We're not talking 16 millimeter, which was done for Bangladesh, which was done for Monterey Pop, for many other films. We're talking 35 millimeter, and we all saw the clips in the anthology, and we all kind of dropped our jaws and said, "Holy." That's fantastic. And where is it? And again, we didn't get it. And I think, and I think they really blew this. I think, the quiet is deafening on this one. And it's really a shame. It's really a shame that they didn't do something here.
Yeah.
Well, as we've talked about many times, I think the Beatles are very much against the whole 50th anniversary of everything. They don't want to hear 50th this and 50th that because it reminds people of how old it is, and you can debate this point all you want, but that's probably the way that they're thinking. And that's probably why we've been hearing about Ron Howard working on the Beatles Live project, because if you present it as a documentary where the emphasis is not on the years or a specific show, that's a whole other approach altogether. And we've talked a lot about the Beatles One and the success of the Beatles One, but part of the reason, well, maybe, I don't know, we can argue over this. There's no reference to years on the Beatles One. It's just they were number one hits. Right. How can you go wrong with number one hits when something is presented that way, without the emphasis being on a year? I think that the four families at Apple probably don't want to be reminded of, how long ago it was, because it could be a turnoff to some people. It's certainly not to us. We think this is the greatest music of all time, but that's not the way that they look at it. So, and you never know. As far as the Beatles One is concerned, here we have a package of something which didn't take much effort to put together.
No effort.
Yeah. And you just assemble all the number one hits. Of course, it was a little bit brilliant that they added the the number ones in the UK that weren't number one here, so you had more bang for your buck. But something that simple became the biggest selling CD of the last decade, and it raises the question: when the Beatles hold back their unreleased material, does it do more to hurt them, or, as you witnessed the success of the Beatles one, does it even matter? Because something as simple as that, which, like I said, it takes no effort. What does it take to put the number ones on one CD? Something like that explodes and has success beyond anyone's expectations.
And continues to sell.
And continues to sell, yes.
Continues to sell and continues to sell and continues to sell in every iteration in which it's released. Well, I think the fact that the Ron Howard film is still in production, that may be a factor in the fact that they have not released the Beatles at Shea Stadium. But I think more it's just the fact that, like the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl, they just don't want those two things released as official Beatles releases because they're simply not up to the quality, musical quality of their studio work.
But it's not like we're talking about the Japan '66 concerts where they really aren't up to quality. They're out of tune and stuff like that, and they didn't even bother to rehearse for that tour. The '65 tour, they were in pretty good shape, and that Shea performance, with John and the organ on "I'm Down" and the whole thing, it's I don't know, it's very exciting. I mean, the one thing I was thinking in terms of the Ron Howard thing is that maybe what they have in mind is that when they put out the Ron Howard on DVD, Shea will come as a second disc.
Right.
Yeah.
Or
And then
even,
they don't have to worry about what year it is.
I've never heard any mention from Apple or anywhere that the Beatles have any intention of releasing the Shea concert.
Right.
I have.
You have? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you share that with us?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was in the 90s. I was told that they had put the whole thing together. They had it all packaged and mixed and everything as they wanted it to be, and they were just waiting to put it out. One time when I interviewed Ringo, I said, "You've got, you're known to have the Shea thing done. You're known to have Let It Be done. Are you going to put these things out while we can still all dance?" And he said, "Yeah, they'll come out." So they wouldn't have bothered bringing in someone to produce and mix and do all of that stuff if they didn't intend to. And I had heard in the early to mid 90s that Shea was something that they had done that they were going to put out. Why it never turned up, I don't know. And the same with Let It Be. You can't, at this point, you can't really get. I don't have any spies in there anymore. But it used to be that you could get some info, but nowadays they're all too scared to talk. And even when you can get one of them at a press thing or a party or something like that, they really just can't tell you anything because they're sort of not authorized. And if it gets back that they said something, that could be it for them, and so no one wants to lose that job, obviously.
And it is a different administration there now.
Yeah.
Even
the thing is that it's a new administration, and you would think that it was an administration that, would be eager to put the stuff out for a number of reasons. I mean, Mr. Jones, who's running it, his background is Sony Legacy. Everything that he put out in Sony Legacy was, newly mixed or remastered versions of classic albums, plus tons of outtakes and bonus tracks and demos. They were beautiful packages. And you have to assume that if you're going to hire a guy like that, it has to be for his expertise at doing this. And yet they haven't really let him do very much.
Sure, because
it must be very frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Because, of course, he has to get the full, the unanimous verdict of the four directors.
There's another thing too. I don't know if you saw it recently in Facebook. Someone posted. I can't. It may have even been Klaus. Someone posted a long excerpt from Klaus Voormann's book, in which he talks about his last meetings with George Anyone read that?
Mm-hmm.
I did.
Well, it has George complaining quite a lot. The Beatles are simply not marketing themselves right. They're not getting things out there. Now, if it were, it's kind of strange coming from George, seeing as George has sat on a number of things. That everything I've heard is that he's responsible for Carnival of Light not coming out because he thinks it's self-indulgent, and he edited the version of Shout because he thought it was self-indulgent, and same with
Right.
You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. And possibly what he thinks of as properly marketing the Beatles is completely different from what we would think of, because his big project was the Love production with Cirque du Soleil. So, but nevertheless, he was, according to Klaus, he was very frustrated at what Apple was not putting out, that Apple was not keeping the Beatles in front of the public all the time. And that's kind of interesting, I think.
That doesn't sound like George to me.
No.
It just doesn't. George was the type of person who he loved to make music for the sake of making music, not so much for the commercial success, certainly later on in his life. He didn't care about the fanfare. He didn't care about the publicity or the attention given to him. He probably wouldn't want to hear the Beatles thrown in his face all the time.
Yeah.
So that doesn't sound like George to me.
I agree. It doesn't, but I mean, it's Klaus reporting it, and he reports it pretty extensively in that section of his book that was quoted. So I don't know. I guess take it with however many grains of salt. But you're right. It does seem counterintuitive with everything we know of George, but
especially since so much of George's own solo archive is sitting there, not having been issued.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, wasn't George the one? And Allan, you probably know this. Who was the one that complained the most about all the ultra rare stuff coming out? Wasn't it George?
I don't know.
Paul
seemed actually okay with it. Paul seemed okay with it so long as it was a bootleg. He had a problem with releasing it. This is pre-anthology, so he obviously got over his problem. But he had a problem with releasing it officially. But I don't think it bothered him that it was a bootleg. And John, we know, collected Beatles bootlegs. So
right.
I think if George objected, it might be that, it was sort of someone else putting it out and not them having control over it. That sounds plausible to me.
Right.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, logic dictates that if the Beatles went through the trouble of cleaning up Shea Stadium and cleaning up Let It Be, that they had plans of releasing it. But maybe they cleaned it up so they can use it whichever way they wanted to, in a documentary or whatever they want. It didn't necessarily mean it was for a release of a complete concert or the TV special.
And of course, there were large chunks of both in the anthology.
Right.
Yeah, but with the Let It Be project, I know that they brought in people who were involved with it, and including Neil, to do interviews specifically about Let It Be. And I don't think it was necessarily stuff that ended up in the anthology. For one thing, I was told that Neil actually, for the very first time and possibly last, did the interviews without a hat on. And I haven't seen any footage like that anywhere. But
I personally think that Let It Be will come out, because Ringo has mentioned it a few times in the last few years.
Yeah.
He hasn't elaborated too much, but the mere fact that he's even saying it, he's saying it will come out eventually. But the thing is, he probably can't say when, because if you've got the Beatles Live project that they're working on, maybe that takes precedence over that. So that's just how I feel about it. But getting back to my original question, do you think that holding back the material, the unreleased material, does more damage to the Beatles, or it just doesn't matter? Because, like I said, if the Beatles 1 could do as well as it did, and we do know that the Beatles anthology was certainly successful, the 3 different double CDs, and the first collection of BBC material did really well.
And the Love Show has certainly been successful.
Right.
Yep.
But, not everything that's been released on the Beatles has been a smashing success.
No.
I mean, Let It Be Naked was not a big success.
Right.
The Yellow Submarine song track didn't do that well. It's not like everything that comes out on the Beatles is automatically going to be a number 1 record, a number 1 album. But still, by and large, the biggest success has been the Beatles 1.
Yep.
So does it really matter whether all the stuff that we know that exists and a lot of stuff that's been bootlegged for many years, whether it even comes out? Because let's face it, those of us that want it that badly enough will find a way to get it. So, does it really matter whether or not it's released commercially? Or does it really do some damage to the Beatles because by releasing all this other stuff, it can only increase interest in them? How do you guys feel about that?
I don't know if it does them damage not releasing it, but I think it would be more interesting for everybody if they did release it. I mean, they would get ink. They would, all these things would be covered. And, look, we can get them on bootlegs, but we end up with a bootleg copy of the Shea program that looks nothing like what we know that film looks like. If they put it out, it's going to be in super shape. And, I think that's what we want. And I think that, I don't know. I don't think it can hurt them to put it out. I mean, I guess they may be thinking that if they put it out and it's not a big success, that hurts them. And they may have to reorient their thinking because they've held this stuff so long that, we're all getting a little bit, we're all turning into aldercockers complaining about the Beatles not releasing stuff. So, and we're all getting older and, some of us aren't making it to when Let It Be comes out and Shea. And so their optimal audience is actually shrinking. So, you would think that they would put it out while the optimal audience is still there.
Right.
But is it the optimal audience? To be honest with you, I just came back from the Fest for Beatles fans in Chicago and saw an awful lot of, young people who were there and very young people, babies, just kids, tweens, teens, 20s. And most of them, frankly, don't care about all that stuff. They care about, the music that they know, which is what they hear, which is, largely is the music on the Red and Blue albums, things like that.
Right.
I think they know the full catalog of the group much better.
Yeah.
From Please Please Me through Let It Be or Abbey Road. I think, it's not just the hits.
Right, but beyond that, they really don't care about, take two of Don't Bother Me and whether it's in stereo and whether the bass is in the left-hand channel or the right-hand channel. They don't care about that stuff. And
you got to have the hi-hat intro on All My Lovin'.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Such a big difference.
Well, we even had it in Name That Tune yesterday, as a matter of fact.
Oh, okay.
And somebody got it.
I just think it's really kind of funny that the Beatles objected so much to the rock and roll music album and the love songs album, and that when they finally settled with EMI in 1989, they put a clause in their contract saying you can no longer do this kind of thing. We have to approve everything. And so, what brilliant idea has Apple come up with? All the number one hits, which to me is not much different than all the songs about girls or all the rock and roll things. It's pretty much the same thing.
Except that it's been wildly successful.
Okay.
There's no arguing that. It's been wildly successful. We were saying just before the show that the idea for the first whispers about the one album kind of appeared at the 2000 Beatle Fest in Chicago. And we were saying at that point, there's no reason to put this out. Why on earth are they doing this? Putting out the same songs over and over, and look what happened.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen with Let It Be Naked. It doesn't happen with
Yellow Submarine
song track. It doesn't happen with a lot of these other. It didn't happen with the Love soundtrack, as a matter of fact. It's only this one simple 27 song collection which has been a phenomenon.
But you could say the Beatles anthology did really well.
Well, all three were #1 albums.
Yeah.
And the first BBC set was also a top 5 album. So they certainly were very successful too, but not on this scale.
Right. So therein lies the question. Do you really have to release all this stuff? Or is it only appealing to the Alpacacas who care about this?
Yeah.
So
I kind of think that a lot of people, even if they're only casually interested in the Beatles, would be interested in seeing a film of them playing at Shea Stadium, playing live, all the whole everything they've heard about screaming girls and all that stuff. And I think they would want to see for themselves what that experience was. And I don't see that it can lose, but
yeah, and not only that, but in this day and age when you can watch almost anything on YouTube,
Yeah.
is there that much of a need to put out a DVD?
Right.
I mean, yes, if it's cleaned up and it's the best picture quality you've ever seen, I'm all for it. But a lot of fans may not care that much. So I don't know. That's why I'm questioning you guys on this.
Well, again, we're talking about something that was filmed in 35 millimeter. I don't see why the hang up. I mean, we're not talking about the grainy, assuming, Ron says the remastered Let It Be footage looks fantastic, but the grainy Let It Be footage looks grainy, and, that's going to put off people. But we don't have that problem apparently with the Shea Stadium. I mean, we all of us saw that what was in the anthology, and it looked great. So, the question is, why not? It's hard to understand.
It's not really hard to understand, because if on one hand, if you want to take into account the Ron Howard film, the fact that maybe they're saving that for the release of that album or the release of that film, and on the other hand, just the fact that all along they have resisted releasing this and Hollywood Bowl because it's the performances are not up to the standards of the Beatles' studio work.
I don't see the problem with that, because it's a live recording and it's history.
But it's not up to their standards. You're talking about the Rolls Royce of pop music catalogs, and to put something out where they've and it's well known that they had to go in and sweeten the sound on the on the Shea Stadium soundtrack because they realized how bad it sounded musically. It's just not up, because frankly, Shea Stadium was not about the music. Shea Stadium was about the Beatles. Shea Stadium was about the occasion, was about this happening of 55,500 kids, mostly girls, putting out this incredible energy, and the Beatles just kind of standing there on stage in wonder at this incredible happening. So it wasn't really about the music. It was about the whole thing, the whole gestalt, if you will, of the event. It was about the event more so than the music. The music is secondary. And it doesn't matter whether it's in stereo or mono. It's secondary.
Getting back to the point that Ken was making, or that Ken was talking about earlier with George Harrison and the marketing, if you ignore things like this for too long, you do hurt the product.
How is it hurting the product when you have the biggest selling album of this century, a collection of 27 #1 hits? How is not putting a semi, a less than passable musical performance out, as part of a documentary film? How is that hurting their image?
Well, I don't think. Number one, I don't think I think we're disagreeing about the less than passable because I don't think that's true. But the other point is, and I guess I'm starting to think like an advertising exec or a marketing executive. Anytime when you put things out, you keep your name before the public, and the more you don't, even
But
if we're talking about the Beatles, they do the product, the brand does suffer,
but the
and I
Beatles'
think.
name is constantly before the public, either through through things like one or these anniversaries or Paul McCartney on tour.
Or
It
or
keeps,
or dummies like me writing every day.
yeah,
I mean, I know, and your point is well taken. But on the other hand, and I'm trying to get to it as quickly as I can here. The chart representation is not there. I mean, is not. They're not making waves in the chart at the moment. You would hope that the Beatles would be trending or something, and
no, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if 10-year-old girls aren't twittering about the Beatles. It doesn't, instead of Justin Bieber. It doesn't. That doesn't matter at all. That has
I
nothing to do with it.
oh
You
I
know,
think that
but
I
you're
think the
talking
Beatles.
about you're talking about you're talking about the Rolls Royce of pop music brands, if you will. And it doesn't matter if they're not on trending on Twitter. Who cares if
I
if
think
they're
I
trending on Twitter? The people that are trending on Twitter, 2 weeks from now are forgotten. That stuff is nauseating to me.
Oh,
Absolutely nauseating.
it may be nauseating to you, but I bet you there are people inside the label, or there are people around that are looking at that and going, how can we get the Beatles rejuvenated that way? I mean, I really think that's true. I mean, Alan, Ken, what do you think?
Alan?
I think that the Beatles and Apple are a business concern, apart from everything else that they might be. And Apple exists to oversee the Beatles marketing, protect their rights, all of those things. And I think that having them before the public with new stuff is an important thing. I mean, not new, but stuff that everybody hasn't already had a million times. I mean, I realize that the one album sold a lot of copies, but it having sold a lot of copies doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that Apple should do or that people want.
Say they're
They're
coming
coming to
after.
take
They're
me
coming
away.
after you,
Haha.
Alan.
So yeah, I mean, I don't see how it can hurt them to have new news in the news instead of old news in the news. I mean, even Shea at this point is sort of old news. I mean,
Yeah,
everybody knows
exactly.
about it. But I think having a spiffy new production, sort of like, look, when they put out the Maisleys Brothers material in a new format with extra stuff that people hadn't seen, I don't know how it sold, but that was kind of exciting, and it
Hmm.
did get some press and it got some attention and it got talked about. And it may not be as good a seller as the one album, but I mean, no one's saying that they shouldn't do one. And well, I would say that they shouldn't, but let's say that nobody is saying they shouldn't do things like the one album for the more general fan. I think that they're gearing everything to the general fan and virtually nothing to the people who were really, really deeply interested in the music that they made.
Because there are more people that are casual fans who only care about the core catalog and don't care about all of this ancillary stuff and take two of Little Child and stuff
Well,
like that.
that may be, but if they put out the one album and it sells to 10 million people, and they put out the Shea Stadium thing and it sells to 400,000 people, that's still 400,000 sales. And it gets the Beatles into the current discussion. I mean, if that thing came out, Rolling Stone would do a big thing about it. All the newspapers probably would. There'd be there'd be
Mhm.
items on the TV news shows, like when the anthology came out, and the TV news show, since they're basically the people who run them are basically people who haven't heard anything that happened before last Tuesday.
Mhm.
They would be presenting this as if, wow, this is some brand new find, the Beatles Shea
Right.
Stadium.
And then
You know,
they would listen to it and see that and hear this inferior recording.
it's not though.
It's this
No,
it's
no.
good. That doesn't sound like Ticket to Ride.
Are
You
we
know,
are we listening to the same
Uh,
recording? I mean, I
It
think it's
kind of does.
they're
It does sound like.
cheesy and they're out of tune, and that's not what Ticket to Ride sounds like.
I honestly don't think that people are going to be turned away from a live performance of the Beatles at Shea because it doesn't sound exactly as the studio recording. They're going to know it's a live recording. I mean, the thing is, we keep expecting the Beatles, or in this case, there's only two left, to think like we do, and they don't, and they have a high standard. How many of us have seen that photo that I've seen posted on Facebook, where there's a photo of the four Beatles from '69, and it reads, "Sorry for raising the bar too high."
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
and that's the thing. The Beatles had very high standards, the highest standards you can imagine. They knew what was good music, what should be released. For the most part, I think their judgment was completely correct on just
Mhm.
about all their studio recordings.
Mhm.
But I do believe, and this is just my opinion, I agree a lot with Allan here, that they care way too much about sales. They shouldn't care that much whether or not a new album or a new CD makes it to number one. And I think that people expect the Beatles to hit number one to the point where if they don't, then it's a bomb or it's a disappointment. So they shouldn't be thinking that way, you
Does
know?
doesn't
It,
Paul McCartney care about sales?
sure he does.
Sure.
And yeah, but he's always putting out new material all the time and he's promoting it a lot. So, I just think there's way too much of an emphasis on the sales, and there's so much interesting stuff that the Beatles have done that remain unreleased. The thing is, if
really.
they release stuff that only sells, like Alan said, 400,000 copies, that's not a disappointment to us. Maybe it would be to them. They shouldn't care as much about that. They would get so much publicity out of any new release. We are looking at a time right now where I personally think there's so much reverence for the Beatles. The slightest little comment that comes out of Paul or Ringo makes headlines.
Mhm.
I mean, they
Yeah.
don't really have to work that hard to get publicity.
Exactly.
They really don't because of who they are and the stature of who they are. That's a reverence that you can't say anybody else has in the world for the most part. I mean, it's a rare breed that gets that kind of publicity for almost anything that goes on in their lives.
Oh, wait,
And
whoa, 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 wait a minute. You're wrong. You are wrong there because if you look on Facebook, if you look
Oh
on,
God.
there's so much celebrity bull that goes on every day. That tracking every breath that people take, every time they pick their nose. The Beatles aren't above that. The Beatles are no better than that.
Yes they are. But Ringo and Paul are the only two people alive who know the kind of fame that the Beatles had, that Elvis Presley had, that Frank Sinatra had, and that Bing Crosby had. They were the biggest entertainment stars of the 20th century. And they are the phenomenons of pop music. And
I will.
Paul and Ringo are the only ones alive. And I'm sorry, Justin Bieber, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Eminem, whoever is trending on Twitter today doesn't have a tenth of the fame that those two men have had for 50 years.
I'm not comparing them to Justin Bieber to any of those guys. What I'm saying is that in the celebrity mill,
Who cares about the celebrity mill?
you'd
The
be
celebrity
surprised.
mill
You'd be
is
very, very, yeah,
celebrity
you'd
mill.
be very surprised, Al.
And you can
Very
put this
surprised.
out, but the celebrity mill is bullshit.
Beep. Oh,
Absolute bullshit.
well,
Paul and Ringo are not celebrities. They are entertainment phenomenons. And they are the only ones still alive who are part of that summit. And I'm sorry, Beyonce is not an entertainment icon. The
Mick
way
Jagger?
Even Mick isn't. Mick isn't. Pete Townsend isn't. Dylan isn't. Nobody. Those two men are the only two people alive who know the kind of fame that the Beatles had.
Whenever I go on the internet and I have my Yahoo page out, there's hardly a week that goes by when I don't see Paul's name or Ringo's name there for something.
Exactly.
And it could be something so insignificant.
Right.
It could. Paul remembers writing Michelle, and all of a sudden, boom, there's an article about it.
Right. Paul's standing on a corner talking on a cell phone, and there's a picture. Right. That's.
But Paul's not above what's happening to a lot of other people. I mean, it's happening to. I see it all the time. It's happening to a lot of other people. I'm not trying to. For anybody that's listening, I'm not trying to, lessen Paul's significance in the world of music, his accomplishments. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just saying that while we all hold the Beatles to above. We all worship the Beatles. There's no getting around that.
We don't worship the Beatles. We respect the Beatles for the greatness that they have, for the greatness of their music, for the greatness of their personalities, for the fact that they were Jimmy O'Neill said it in October of '64, the entertainment phenomenon of the century.
Right.
For what they were.
But we also need to be realistic. This is 2015, not 1964, and things are not the same. And much as I would love them to be, they're not as magic as they used to be. I'm not saying they're not great. I'm not saying their history isn't fantastic. They haven't, I'm not saying anything like that. I'm sure they know that. They've got a lot of competition going on now, and whether they know that. Believe me, they do know that, and it's not something that I really.
There's no competition as such. They're not in competition with anybody.
Depends on how you look at it.
No, they're not in competition with anybody.
I think you have to.
I wouldn't say a catalog from 50 years ago is competing with new artists of today. How can you even look at it that way, Steve?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing if you're talking about a brand new release of unreleased Beatles recordings, or if the DVD comes out of the Beatles at Shea, it's a new product that hasn't come out legally, and that will be in competition with other stuff that's out there. But, Paul and Ringo are not thinking about, how Beatles recordings from 50 years ago, how well that's selling compared to the current artists of today. I don't think they think about that at all.
No, absolutely not.
Maybe not. I mean, I would say I would think they probably have to, because it's all part of the. I mean, they have to know they have to have an idea that something is going to sell before they'll put it out. They're not going to just throw it out there in the ether and say, "Here, folks, take it."
Well, Ringo puts out new albums, and he knows that they're not going to be big sellers.
Ringo's a different story. Ringo is a different story. He's realistic. Go ahead.
And Paul, Paul, I think Paul aims higher, but he's not thinking, I mean, yes, he did kind of attach his star to, the Kanye West and Rihanna, a few months back. But I don't think when he puts out a new album, he's aiming at having a huge hit record. I think he's aiming at having a respectable sales record, as was the case with New. But he's not, I don't think he's delusional enough to think that he's in competition with any of these, frankly, here today, gone tomorrow, Twitter trenders or whatever the hell, I mean, it's so ludicrous.
Yeah, I think that Paul cares. I think Paul cares a lot about his record sales, but I think he's realistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
He knows that he's not going to sell as well as the biggest selling artist of today, and he shouldn't expect to.
Right.
As great a talent as he is,
yeah,
it's just not realistic.
Exactly.
I'm not going to argue with that at all. I'm not going to argue with that at all. So I have one more news item that I came across on my screen that I forgot, that I haven't published yet, actually, that I'm going to put up tonight. And Ken, you'll recognize this because we had talked about this back in the earlier days of the show. Joe Smith, who wrote Off the Record and did a bunch of interviews with George and Paul and John and George Martin
And
and
Yoko.
And
Yoko,
Yoko.
is getting a star on the Walk of Fame on August 27th, and they announced that Bonnie Raitt and Jackson Browne are going to be speaking. So that just was announced this morning, and I actually have been working on that today and hadn't thrown it because I've been busy all day and I haven't thrown it up yet, but I am going to put it up tonight. But anyway, so that's a interesting piece of news, and that book is fantastic, and you can get it for like less than 50 cents before the mailing on Amazon, and I recommend everybody just look for it on Amazon. It's called Off the Record. Let me give you the full title. It's called Off the Record: An Oral History of Popular Music, and it's an 89 book, but it's readily available, and it's well worth it.
And I think the tape archives are still available online, right?
On the Library of Congress, yeah.
Yes.
They put a lot of the interviews, including some of the Beatle interviews, on the Library of Congress site, and they're available free. And I'm not sure you can't download them, I don't think, but you can if you.
Right.
Our listeners are very resourceful. They can do audio captures and God knows what. Sure. They can get them. But yeah, so there you go. Okay.
I would highly recommend that book, because if you love really good interviews, I mean, there's a good cross section there of entertainers and musicians of all different styles of music, and most of them are about 2, 3, 4 pages. So
right.
they're very concise and very informative. So.
Right. I'm looking at the cover here. Some of the names on the cover are Artie Shaw, Woody Herman, Ella Fitzgerald, Ray Charles, Barbra Streisand, Little Richard, Bob Dylan, Smokey Robinson, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, George Harrison, Yoko Ono, Elton John, Paul Simon, Rod Stewart, David Bowie, Phil Collins, Billy Joel, Jerry Lee Lewis, Joan Baez, Tony Bennett, Neil Diamond, Van Morrison, Jackson Browne, Robert Plant, and Tom Petty. And that's not even all of them. I mean, it's a superb book. And like I said, it's from 1989. It may be out of print, but it's fairly easy to get. And if you have any kind of a music library, you owe it to yourself to get that book.
Mm-hmm.
All right, before we close, we just want to give a quick wrap-up of the two major events of the past weekend of August the 14th through the 16th. And Al, you were a part of the Fest for Beatle fans
in Chicago.
Right. In Chicago. How did that go?
It actually was the turnout was surprisingly good. It was probably the best in about 3 or 4 years. Friday night, in fact, was surprisingly strong. Saturday was very strong. Sunday was less so, but that generally happens. And it was very good. I did get to see Dick Biondi make his appearance, complete with the. In fact, I mentioned it earlier with the clip of him playing "Please Please Me" in February of '63, courtesy of Bruce Spicer, and he and Bob Eubanks sat down with Terry Hemmert on stage and just sort of exchanged stories for quite a while, and then that moved into a Beatles version of the Newlywed Game, which, from what I understand, because I was actually somewhere else doing panel discussions and such, went very well. And there are musical performances by Billy Kinsley and of the from the Escorts and Terry Sylvester.
Right.
They were probably the two main guests. Also a performance on Sunday afternoon by the Weaklings.
Mm-hmm.
And plus the normal concerts on Saturday and Sunday night. And plus in my end of things, we had a busy schedule of panels and audio visual presentations, and finally got to see the Fabratory, where which is kind of an experimental section where people who don't normally get to kind of express themselves at the fest can do various and sundry things, and it's definitely there are definitely different things going on at the fest these days.
Right. Did you witness any interesting interviews yourself personally?
Well, the main one that I did see, as I said, was the conversation with Dick Biondi and Bob Eubanks and Terry Hemmert. They were the main ones in the ballroom. Unfortunately, I didn't see any of the others in the ballroom because I was, as I said, involved elsewhere with panels and things like that.
Okay.
And we had some interesting ones. One with Andrew Grant Jackson and myself on 1965. In fact, on Friday night, we had a very interesting conversation with Bruce Beiser and Chuck Gunderson and Wally Podrazik and myself about the Beatle year of '65, which really kind of took in more of the year itself. And then an interesting panel on Beatles podcasting, as a matter of fact, with Richard Buskin and Robert Rodriguez from Something About the Beatles, and Anthony Robustelli, who does the multi-track meltdown on Beatles-orama, and myself representing this show. So,
Okay.
And you didn't give away all our secrets.
I tried, but unfortunately couldn't.
You mentioned Life with the Lions.
Didn't mention Life with the Lions either. So neither of the our secret weapons was used.
You didn't have a panel on that album?
Unfortunately, no, we didn't have room for it.
Jeez. Next year, Al.
Next year, absolutely.
That'll be when we do a panel together, the four of us. It'll
Right.
just be Life with the Lions.
On Life with the Lions, right?
Okay. All right. And as for me, Danbury Fields Forever was so much fun. I can't believe how much I enjoyed it. And the main reason why is because I got to see all these different performers, tribute bands, who are all different in their own way. I think that Charles Roseday did an excellent job in presenting all these different bands that there's no similarities between one band to another. You had bands there that did early Beatles. You had bands that played later Beatles. You had a psychedelic Beatles band. You had one that I've always wanted to see that I heard about from Long Island called Penny Lane. And they wore the Sgt. Pepper suits, and they played a lot of songs on Sgt. Pepper and a lot of psychedelic stuff. And they had a couple of bands that specialized in solo Beatle music, one called After Fab. I know, Steve, you interviewed Ad Bach from that band, and they're from Massachusetts. They are phenomenal. It's strictly solo Beatle music, and they got such a great reaction. The crowd there wanted an encore, which they gave. And the Onos, that's another band from Massachusetts. And Steve, I know you know Rachel and Wayne Cabral, who are both in that band. They also had something called Harry Fest, which is a one-day event in Massachusetts, which is actually going to happen October the 17th. And it's kind of like the same concept as Danbury Fields, with Beatles tribute bands specializing in Beatles and George. And it's a charity thing. They've raised money for cancer in recent years. And anyway, they're part of this band called the Onos, and they're a quintet, and they're phenomenal. 4 of the 5 members, all except Rachel, who plays the drums, they all share lead vocals, and they're all great singers. And they play some, I don't even want to call it oddball, because I just love the fact that they're mixing the stuff that you wouldn't expect to hear. They actually closed their set with Well, Well, Well.
Wow.
Wow.
And they were amazing. Any band that closes their set with that song from the Plastic Ono Band is a band that I deeply respect. And they always play Don't Let Me Wait Too Long, George's song from Living in the Material World, which they send out to me because they know how much I love that album.
Sure.
And, they mix that with some Beatles and usually lesser known or songs that bands don't play, like Blue Jay Way they did. They had the Blue Meanies there. They're a familiar band. They've been around for a long time in the New York area. They've been known for not only being a Beatles tribute band, but also a lot of other 60s groups. They do Beach Boys, they do Kinks, and they were phenomenal. And they also play a lot of the songs that you don't expect most Beatle bands to do, and they really are very close in sound to what the Beatles did. I was really impressed with when they did Dr. Robert, especially. You don't expect bands to do a song like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we had Hilton Valentine there as a special guest, the guitarist from the Animals, and he jammed with the Blue Meanies for a couple of Animal songs, which was really cool. And the Hoffners closed the show. They're a band that's been around in Connecticut for a long time. They recreated the entire 1965 Shea set list, and they sounded great. They sounded the best I've ever heard them. They're there almost every single year. And, there's so many different acts there. They all did something different. And whether they're trying to come close in sound to the Beatles or do their own arrangements, I love all of it. I love that whole cross section. And the thing is, if you're into Beatles tribute bands, you can either just look up all the different names of what's in your area and investigate them one by one and go to different clubs, or you can see them all at once, or many of them at once at something like this. And I had an absolute blast sharing the stage with another MC, Gary Thoreau, who does a show called The History of Rock and Roll on Rewound Radio. Mm-hmm. And Charles was great. And Candy Leonard was there, as a special guest. She was there with the authors panel, along with Fred Velez, who's written a book on the Monkees. We all know Fred from being a big Beatle fan and Monkees fan.
Sure.
Doing a lot at Monkees conventions in particular, and also helping out Charles with his Beatle conventions. So, we had a fantastic time. It was 90-plus degrees weather.
Wow.
And I felt it on stage, believe me. I don't know how any band like Penny Lane can wear the Sgt. Pepper outfits in that kind of heat.
Yeah.
So kudos to them and to all the bands because they were really phenomenal. So, it was a great time. It really was. The fact that it actually fell on the actual date of the 50th anniversary, it was timed perfectly, of the Beatles at Shea. It was really nice, and you couldn't have asked for better weather. So, this has become an annual thing with Charles, Danbury Fields Forever, and hopefully we'll have another one next year.
Cool.
And thanks to everyone who came up to me who was familiar with my show in Connecticut of Every Little Thing, and also I had a few people who are familiar with our show. So I got some really great feedback from those people. So if you're listening right now, thanks to all of you for coming to the show and for talking with me about both my shows. So there you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Oh, in fact, I should add that at the fest, Liverpool on Saturday night also played the Shea Stadium set list.
Oh, nice.
On the 50th anniversary. And there was also one of the new features is a section called Apple Jam, where a lot of Beatle bands play in a section of the hotel, kind of apart from the main stage.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's kind of like what goes on in New Jersey.
Yeah, exactly.
On the upper level, there's always several bands who are jamming, and also on the main level too.
Right.
Kind of close to where the bar area is.
Yeah. Well, these are actually specific bands as opposed to just the jam sessions.
Yeah, that are much looser.
Yeah, exactly. These are actually specific bands who had specific set times, including our friend Scott Erickson.
Oh yeah. He's a great musician.
Yeah, who did a set on I think on both Saturday and Sunday afternoon.
Okay. So if anyone wants to get in touch with us, our email address is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We also have our own Facebook page for Things We Said Today. If you want to get in touch with us on Twitter, what do you have to do, Steve?
It's a @ with Things We Said Fab. So that's the way you can write to us on Twitter.
And you can get in touch whether you're trending or not.
Yes, that's true.
All right, this has been a lot of fun. So, for Steve Marinucci, Allan Kozin, Al Sussman, and myself, Ken Michaels, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.